Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 12 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, most importantly an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. Most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig a little deeper. But today's episode is our final special edition episode of the Australian Open Roundup. But today's topic plays its own role, like so many other episodes, in developing the player, parent to coach for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So, as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our final special edition for the Australian Open, and I know you're thinking it is wrapped up and over and done with, but this is, we have done days 1 through to 10, and I wanted to wait a couple of days to really round up, I guess, the final few matches, which I think we all know are the most exciting in incredibly, I think, profound ways. If you've been listening to us for some time now, you are familiar with these special editions. They've been roughly 3 to 4 to date over, I think, especially the month of January, the Australian Summer of Tennis, with a few more in between. If you were new, I really would encourage you to track back on a couple of our episodes just to, I guess, better ascertain and understand where we're coming from, where we've been, but to come more familiar with, I think, some key concepts that I'm sure will be dropped throughout today's episode. So we have days 11, 12, 13, 14 and 15 to cover, which really does sound like, oh my goodness, a lot. But remember, in those initial special episodes, we had the first and second rounds to get through, and there were over 50 matches discussed in immense detail over the course of those, I think, special editions. So we've got the other half of the quarterfinals on both sides, so the women's and the men's sides, the semi-finals and the finals. I think the flip side, however, is that we all know what's happened. We all know the results, and we are going to get there. But I wanted to dive deeper and to share why and what we can look forward to throughout the 2024 season. But before I get started, or we dive a bit deeper, I wanted to share, I think, something I posted earlier this week on TikTok, which was one of those tips that I try to share on a weekly basis-ish. And those of you who are familiar, my current release, so the new release has been out for a little over a month now, which is titled How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking. The release prior to that, which was the 7 keys to optimize your life, using tennis to develop behaviors that deliver optimal performances in play and in life. The really, I think, exciting part is I was watching Sabalenka and Sinner respectively, and I thought, we knew this, I'm pretty sure that this has actually been forecast, in a manner of speaking. So again, if you're familiar with Beyond Top 10 Tennis and where we've been, where we're going, you understand our predictive analytics. And the most exciting part is we tracked both Sabalenka and Sinner respectively more than 2 years ago. So that release, the 7 Keys, came out roughly 2 years ago, and it actually pinpointed the rise of both of these players and the increasing likelihood for them to achieve Grand Slam success and or multiple, which Sabalenka has now done and Sinner has now done. And I wanted to start with that to really share how exciting and profound our data is. But also I think across the tennis landscape, data is becoming more common, which is wonderful in good ways. However, to share a very big differential, and I've written about this over the course of the last probably 2 weeks with our specific really niche blog posts there about how data can be used in different ways, and typically at the moment data is used to more so inform strategy. So it pinpoints a player's weakness and how I think the player then is going to slightly modify and or adapt their game to, I think, look at taking advantage of that weakness and to get the win. This one, however, of course it works hand in hand with that, but it's giving the player themselves the control. So more control on how to dictate, opposed to relying on those analytics exclusively on their opponent. Now, and or how to improve their game. Because what our analytics do it doesn't only track these profound results, because that's how incredible they are. No other data trend or analytical platform is capable of this or is able to do this. This is how exciting it is. And again, if you're familiar, you know how excited I get about this, because it comes back to the player and the coaches and what they actually specifically and explicitly need to do and develop in their game. So our data goes, irrespective if you are a top 10 tennis player looking to progress towards the top 3 to secure your maiden championship, as we've been able to predict Sinner to do so, that's not the only player. We were able to track Swiatek before she won her maiden slam. Also Djokovic, Medvedev, Zverev's rise back into the top 10 is not shocking whatsoever, which are some really cool statistics. Sabalenka, obviously, as well, that I've touched on, and Swiatek, Rybakina, why that wasn't so surprising. Makova, when she made the French Open final. Vondrasova, some really, I think, profound, and this is the data. It's not just going, oh, I think. So it's not subjective in that respect. It's quite explicit by saying, if this player does this, if their technical parameters progress in this way, this is what is going to happen, as in we know this. And the best part is that it mitigates injuries. So, and what I mean by that, and I really want to keep the theme of the Australian Open going, is that irrespective if you're looking at players in the first round or through to, I think, roughly the quarterfinals, it was still the case. Maybe the finals, I think, because it has been a few days now, that players in some way, shape or form were carrying, let's say, a slight injury. We obviously don't know, or I personally do not know. I was not in the locker room with them to say what's going on. But what I mean by that is they were taped. A part of their body was taped. And typically when a part of a body is taped, aside from the ankles and or wrists as a precautionary measure, there could just be a little bit of a niggle. So a bit of a weakness there. And it could be from overload and the conditioning's not quite there, and that's understandable if this is I think a new level of play. However, if it is an ailment of some form, we look at how can we modify your technique, your technical applications, and how we go about that is we look at the kinetic chain and we look at everything involved in that to accommodate the whole body. And by doing that, we mitigate injuries. And it's not just, again, subjective. This is obviously backed by science, and again 150,000 plus inferences as a baseline over 11 years as a minimum. And I touched on this earlier this week. It's 11 years of data capture. There's an additional 10 years prior to that of review and analytical review. It's something that I started doing at a very young age, also as a player. And I used to study elite players quite carefully. And then when I became a coach, I did the same from a coaching standpoint. And I was actually still playing at that time, ironically. And then over the years it progressed, and then my doctorate was undertaken, which was obviously next level and very, I think, data intense, as it needed to be, on players and coaches on the WTA and ATP tours. If you're not familiar with that, I really would encourage you to hop on over to AIM International and click on Dr. B there, and it will show you, I think, a bit of my background and how we got to where we are now, and all of the work that I've personally done to this point that really underscores, I think, the how powerful this data is, but more so how we've been able to inform and get to the point of leveraging predictive analytics to see how players are going to track if they integrate certain facets into their game. Now, the most exciting part about this, if you're familiar with another one of my texts, which is I Am Your Tennis Coaching Guru, it's a bit of fun there. But what it does, it's a 10-year pathway towards 20 years of play. So what that means is that it sets you up for that initial 10 years. So you could be 6-7 years of age. You need to learn those fundamentals up until you're that almost elite high-performing player, so 16-17 years of age, for example, which pushes you then into that second decade of play. And all of this work until now, it essentially holds your hand in one way, shape or form to ensure you progress towards that top 10 tennis ranking, and what you need to do along the way, what technical applications you need to implement into your game over time. And there's obviously a lot of repetition there. There's a very big argument, for example, that to build a skill, now this could be, let's look at it as a discrete skill, which is a part of a serial skill. So recall, a serial skill comprises of multiple discrete skills. And so the argument goes that you need to perform a given skill 10,000 times before you can master that skill, or it becomes autonomous and isn't as susceptible, let's say, to breaking down under pressure. So that is not just 1 year, 2 years. That's a good handful of years to get to that point when you're working on not just one but potentially multiple discrete skills within your game. So you're building those patterns of play that we've touched on in previous episodes, but also blog posts. And so by using these texts, which are 11 that are the specifically here, recall, I think I do have those 12 books published, but one of them was and or is a fictional release. So where I'm going here is that if you follow this pathway and you progressively integrate these key technical parameters, and obviously there are different stages from those developmental years, which is around 3 to 4 years, to let's say that middle, that high performance almost player. And so you've got another 2 to 3, then you've got that really serious high performing player towards the elite player for the later half, until you're ready to make that transition into that second decade of play. Now, depending on the age you are at when you make that transition, also depends on that rate of success when that happens. If you are a little bit of a late bloomer, so you begin that initial 10 years when you're about 11, 12 years of age, then your second decade of play doesn't start until your early 20s, so you may not peak and be positioned to progress towards the top 10 and achieve Grand Slam success until you're in the later years of your 20s. For example, those who achieve success a lot sooner typically start their transition very early, but it's also fast-tracked because those fundamentals are more likely, let's use the term rapid fire. Now, I've touched on that previously, but we want to be very careful here because more often than not, if it is too quick, what happens is that there's a lull and typically a regression. One of the interesting stats that I've recently read, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't done too much of a background, so it is something that I've just come across, and I thought it was quite interesting, is that Roger Federer, he won his first Grand Slam after the 17th try, and the same has happened to Sinner, which is very cool. So it shows you that trajectory in a manner of speaking, but what that means, it means that you've had roughly 4 years on tour playing Grand Slams, getting knocked back, then slowly making those steady progressions, and then you're ready. Now, this is a very healthy sign. I'm sure that other players have very similar metrics opposed to immediate success. And look, there's nothing wrong at all with immediate success. Raducanu is a very good example. However, that was followed by a very steep regression, and I'm sure she's on her way back. But on Andreescu, the same thing happened. So you need to be careful there. But unfortunately, it wasn't just because of their level of play or performance. It was they succumbed to injury, and that is what happens if it is too quick and it is not managed in alignment with what we call the keys. So again, you're familiar with, if you've been following along, the 7 keys, and then my new release, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking, is actually, the subtitle there is The Power of the 8th Key. So there is 8 keys in total. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, what are keys? Like, what's going on? So they essentially, and again, one of my blog posts in the last fortnight touched on this. We view them as potentially subsets. So we're going to break down everything into 8 subsets, or let's say categories, but I feel categories are a bit too broad. And so there are 8 distinct areas a player needs to adhere to and integrate into their game to develop and to track towards a top 10 tennis ranking. More explicitly, what we know is that if you are not inside the top 10, you do not have access to, you are not integrating the 8 keys. That is how explicit it is, which is incredibly exciting, because if you're a top 20 player and you want to become a barrier breaker, you just need to check yourself, which means get a hold of these 11 texts, become very familiar with that, understand what these 8 keys are, and I can almost guarantee you within the next 1 to 2 seasons, you will cross the threshold into the top 10. And that's what I talk about when it's a world first. It is so incredibly exciting and rewarding, because none of this has ever been done before. And it's a very big heads up for the player who wants to. And the best part is, every single player inside the top 10 should and or has access to all 8 keys. If you do not have access and you find yourself inside the top 10, there is increasing likelihood you're going to regress outside the top 10 within the season. You are not capable, unfortunately, of maintaining your hold inside the top 10. That's how also exciting it is that we know why players are able to maintain a top 10 tennis ranking and why other players are not. And we know the numbers, whether it's that 8% that hold on, that 2% every season that it's not, the 2% that are able to cross the threshold. I've touched on that previously, and also I've run that home in recent posts as well, because again, the last fortnight over the Australian Open, I did make the effort to do a lot of writing there, which was, I think, over 13,000 words, going on 15,000 words, whilst tracking all of these metrics. So it was a very heavy week in this respect, but that's why I wanted to, I think, shed further insight into how we know that. It's not of a case of just rolling out of bed and going, this is what's going to happen. No, there's no crystal ball there. It's very careful, meticulous analytics and a very careful analysis of each respective player, but also their data trends. Interestingly though, since my latest book was released, it did not actually specifically track player analytics, which means for the last 12-ish months, almost actually more than that, these players have not explicitly been tracked because the 8th key and all the work that had to go into it was not specific to these players, so we didn't use the chart work. The chart work has already been done, so it was the next level, which means we've had some newcomers, in a manner of speaking, come through in the last, let's say, 12 to 18 months, and they haven't essentially been followed or tracked if they weren't trackable, if they weren't on the radar, say, 18 to 24 months ago. And nothing's wrong with that. It's just saying that if there is a newcomer, they've definitely made some key progressions, whilst our core focus was obviously on sharing that 8th key, which is and has been incredibly important. But now it also puts us in a position to go, okay, who are these newcomers? Let's put them on the radar and track them carefully. Which again brings me to this quarterfinals to semi-finals, finally, of the Australian Open. Because recall in our previous episodes when we touched on the round of 16, that I shared that if a player makes the round of 16 at a Grand Slam, they are essentially automatically on the radar. I'm going to track their progress over the next, let's say, 12 to 24 months, and to see if they have that capacity to ascend inside the top 10, how we can nitpick, in a manner of speaking, their strengths to their weaknesses, which other players can use to their advantage as well. So it's a very different type of analytics, but it empowers the athlete as a whole, opposed to just how a player plays their game. It's more fine-tuned, it's more explicit on how to use a player's game to be a detriment to the opponents, which is really exciting. It really brings, I think, science and data to a very new level, and it pushes the game further. And I think my core objective here is by helping players, athletes, coaches maintain their health, so they are mitigating injuries. They can reach the absolute peak pinnacle of play without compromising their health, so there is no need to sustain an injury, whilst obviously looking after the athlete body as a whole, but also taking their peak performance level to the next level. So we've touched on the baseline and pushing it further to create that new baseline. So we also know that's what it's all about too, is that if you're a top 20 player, we need to push and push and push until you get to that next level. Okay, so now I think it's time to dive into the second half of the quarterfinals. So recall in our previous episode, we reviewed the first half of the quarterfinals along with a round of 16 matches. But now it's time to dive into these matches. So I want to start on the women's side. And one of, I think, the biggest matches was Zheng versus Kalinskaya. Now, I want to preface this that I have been quite conscious that my pronunciation of Zheng, I believe, is incorrect. So please bear with me, and I apologize in advance and previously for that mispronunciation. Though that is, I think, I am based in Australia, and I think it's very typical for an Australian to share it that way, because to us that's how it reads. So I do apologize, so please bear with me. For the correct pronunciation, please do by all means send that through. But it's really important here when we're looking at Zheng coming through 12th seed against Kalinskaya. I want to build upon from what I've just shared. Zheng has not been tracked, which means she has ascended to number 12 in the world over the space of the last 24 months. And within that space, those 24 months, she has peaked. So she's arrived on the scene. I believe there's a quarterfinal appearance prior to this. This is her second quarterfinal in the space of the last 6 months. So this is quite quick. However, if 24 months ago this was happening, it'd be very different. Would have liked to see round of 16s throughout that period more frequently, and then to have this ascension towards the top 10, because with this quarterfinal result, Zheng is now ranked inside the top 10. She is the first barrier breaker of the season on the WTA Tour, and typically there's no more than 2 who are able to maintain that per season. So that's actually very interesting, very early on. But Kalinskaya, even though she went down, I really want to run home some of her key metrics, which are equally as impressive. By impressive, I mean her metrics almost toed the line with Zheng. This is her breakthrough season already. Has never made this level at a Grand Slam in any way, shape or form. Though her metrics as well as Zheng's were towing the line, as in this match could have gone either way. Now let's remember that first set was a tiebreaker, and it did go to Kalinskaya, which is very important. Second set, that's only really one breaker serve. What I'm going to say happened then in the third set is that Zheng's experience toppled. Kalinskaya did not have the legs to maintain her level of play, and I think that became very evident in the third, as that her movement started to lag. Zheng, however, you could see obviously from her level of play and that ranking. To get that ranking, you need to play a number of matches, more so than any other player who is not seeded. To maintain that seeding, you're progressing all year round in some way, shape or form to maintain that ranking. But to maintain a ranking on the cusp of the top 10, you need steady and consistent results, whether they are wins or those quarterfinal, semi-final appearances in lower ranked tournaments in comparison or contrast to Grand Slams. So that was actually, that third set was the best I'd seen Zheng play, but I really wanted to, I think, underscore the performance of Kalinskaya, because I'm going to flag Kalinskaya. And I've said this before, and I've shared it in the post in the last fortnight, to progress towards the top 30, towards the top 20, if she's able to maintain this level of play. When it comes to Zheng, however, I will not be surprised if she regresses outside the top 10 within the next couple of months before the French Open, only because it's been very quick in this respect. However, given that Zheng's performance here ended the semi-finals really up to ante, if she's able to maintain that, she will, I believe, keep her hold inside the top 10, and potentially, if those key progressions are made throughout the seasons, I would probably say watch out come time for the US Open, because given her quarterfinal appearance last year, she's definitely on the cards for potentially a semi-final finals appearance if her level of maintenance is taken up a notch. So very interesting insights there. Kalinskaya, on the other hand, I'm going to be very interested actually when the French Open comes to see her level of play, and Wimbledon all year round, and to see if she's able to latch onto a seeding, depending on her level of maintenance throughout, I think, the next couple of months more specifically. All right, the next quarter final I want to move on to, Yastremska over Noskova. This was a little bit heartbreaking for Noskova. I think everyone needs to remember that she's still a teenager. And that was really, wasn't, I think, run home in this respect, because a more quieter player, and we've got some exceptional more quiet or reserved players on tour, and Noskova held her own, was absolutely phenomenal. And she had some incredible wins, but Yastremska, she stuck to her game. This was, I think, one of her best matches. She did not give Noskova a chance to play her game, and I think this was really Yastremska's match in just a really positive way, and that needs to be run home. Despite, I think, the semi-finals, this was a very solid outcome for Yastremska. Noskova, though, good things I believe are to come. I'm going to say watch out for the French and Wimbledon to see how her performance tracks. Yastremska, I believe before she had to take time away from the tour, she was quite close to breaking into the top 20, and after this result, I'm pretty sure her ranking is quite close to her ranking high. I wouldn't be surprised if she cracks inside the top 20, but it's going to be very interesting to see if she hovers around that ranking range or regresses. I'd really like to see what happens again between now and, let's say, Wimbledon, to see these key players and their progressions, and if they're able to maintain these peak performances. But what's really important here is that, remember, let's say around November, December, there are a couple of episodes that shared why the Australian Open had these newcomers, these surprise packers, players that were not seeded or were not expected to make a round of 16 or quarters. And all of a sudden, we have all of these players, Kalinskaya, Zheng, Noskova, Yastremska, who were not expected, let's say, to make this stage of a Grand Slam, and here they are. And that episode back then underscored why, when it comes to off-season peak performance patterns to parameters, the work involved, if and or when those 8 keys are integrated, how that time off has been managed. And this is why it's not surprising, and why some of the seeded players, actually in an ironic way, can be somewhat underprepared because they've only had a short off season, whether it's 6 to 8 weeks, whereas these other players that are not seeded have had 3 to 4 months of off season time where they have been working incredibly hard, again for longer because they've had a long off season, and earlier on in the year they're able to peak. So the interesting thing is these players are peaking now. Typically they fall off and they're not able to peak throughout the season, and then on the other hand, the seeded players who did not progress this Australian Open, typically they peak throughout the year and or later on, and they're able to maintain that. However, there obviously is that grey area where some of them, the newcomers, are able to maintain, and that's how we know and can underline that these players are primed to hit a top 10 tennis ranking progressively and or steadily. If not this season, it'll be next season. So that's why the next couple of months are going to be very important for these newer players at this level of play, because of course we know they've been around for some time, but this level of play is new. Now let's see if this level of play can be maintained. An example that I think most are familiar with, whether it's we've got Andreescu regressed, Raducanu regressed, Fernandez at the finals. She's still hovering around the top 30, but hasn't obviously been able to make that later stage of a Grand Slam. They're just some key plays that come to mind. We've got a handful on the men's side from Kakanov, and he's had peaks. Hercax has had peaks. We will get to that one later, but we're looking for more. Rune, he fell off early. Tsitsipas, he fell off early, just as examples. But we know some players have reached higher, they've progressed further, but we're looking for that level of maintenance. And it's quite explicit, but they're really what I referred to in the past and through my work is micro discrepancies that really separate these players and how we can pinpoint that. Okay, that's a lot. Now, these are the quarterfinals of the women's, and I want to continue along the women's side, and then we will switch over to the men's. So semi-final stage now, we've got Zheng over Yastremska. This was a really good match, but it was Zheng who, this is where I think she actually played her best tennis I had seen all tournament, and I thought that actually is a top 10 player, and I was really happy and excited for her. Very happy to see that level of play. There are a couple of concerns in her technical metrics that look like they are a high probability of leading to injury within the next 2 to 3 years. That's probably my biggest concern when looking at her play. She does, however, use some key metrics that enable her to progress. It's just she has some additional ones that exacerbate specific joints of her body, which put them under pressure, so that they compromise specific functional parameters at play. Yastremska, on the other hand, she played, I'm going to say, quite solid, but this was not her best match. Zheng did not let her play. So what Yastremska had done to players all tournament long, Zheng finally was able to do to her. But this was, I think, the standout match. Despite, I think, the chatter around the championship match with Sabalenka, obviously over Zheng, this was actually a very good performance of Zheng, and it really needs to be remembered. And really underscores why she's crossed that threshold in the top 10, and also why she was able to make the finals of the Australian Open. All right, that brings me to the other semi-final, which was an absolute blockbuster. Of course, probably like most, I was hoping it was going to go to 3. I really was. But that tie break, I was so happy. Gauff was able to climb her or claw her way back to make it to that tie break. But Sabalenka, she was too strong. Now, if you read the blog piece, which was a play-by-play of the first set, when up until I think it was 5-all, and then I said, no, I'm going to stop. I'm just going to sit back and enjoy the match. But this is what I'm sharing now. And it's the first I've actually done in a while, but it was showing you what I was seeing from the very beginning until it was 5-all, and why the match was unfolding this way. Very interesting. But also how I was able to identify with their key metrics, those key patterns of play, how Sabalenka was going to end up overcoming Gauff. At the beginning of the match, it looked like it was quite an even playing field for different reasons, despite how solid Sabalenka had been all tournament. Gauff had really been consistent. But this actually flipped the script from let's say the US Open final. And this is actually the best I've seen Sabalenka play. So we went from one peak to the next. So irrespective, when she progressed to number one in the world briefly last season, this performance almost correlates with that type of rankings ascension, which is very exciting. So she definitely is on the cusp of claiming that number one ranking, but we need to remember this is one Grand Slam. She's at 2, Swiatek is at 4 Grand Slams, so that 1 and 2 differential, or what's separating them, I think is correct, how it stands. But I'd love to see them toe the line more frequently, because both of those players have very different games. Okay, so the semi-finals, we want to get to the finals. Zheng, Sabalenka, this was run home. I think from the get-go, Zheng was a little bit starstruck and Sabalenka ran away with it. Even when Zheng found a bit of a groove, Sabalenka just found a little bit more fire and she ran home. And I think the best part about this match is that Sabalenka was not phased. Recall a couple of years ago, Sabalenka definitely would have been phased, and I definitely would have seen a bit of a tantrum. Very lighthearted there, but she definitely was not having as much fun on court. This just looked like she was enjoying herself, which really needs to be highlighted. And she was able to play her game. She was playing fluidly. Her patterns of play were all in sync. It was her match, and it was her match to win, and so she did. Zheng, unfortunately, was on the receiving end of that. However, it was an exceptional final. I think this was better than her first slam win. This performance, I think, really highlighted her level of play and that her game has finally come together. And now 2 Grand Slams, and again, our predictive analytics, we saw this coming. If this, in a manner of speaking, came together, and it really is wonderful to see, because seeing a player who had suffered with those ups and downs in recent seasons, and to really, I think, maintain that baseline, that level of maintenance, and reach those new peak performances is incredibly, it's incredible for the game. And I think having a 1 and 2 this close now, one with 4 Grand Slams, one with 2, and also Gauff following very closely behind. Rybakina, despite her result this season, is very, same with Jabeur. All of these players and more, I think women's tennis is in an incredibly healthy place. The best I think it's been in 2 to 3 seasons, where there was a bit of fluctuation there. Where obviously Barty was reigning, now Swiatek reigned, but now we've got a couple of players in the mix that are very solid. Vondrousova, Rybakina, Jabeur, Sabalenka, Swiatek, all Grand Slam titles and true contenders in their own right. And I think this season is going to be quite interesting. if someone else steps up to the plate, or what I'm really looking for is one of those players to step up and claim maybe not just one but another two. Now, I have a feeling, which I'm not going to share, which player that's going to be, and that's really going to underscore some really exciting key metrics, but it's also going to separate and show those micro discrepancies in the other set of players and what they're lacking, and that is only inside the top 10, which really underscores how I think explicit it is to get inside the top 10, what you need to be capable of, and that level of maintenance to that baseline. All right, that is a lot. I think now it is time to move over to the men's, and we have to start at the quarterfinal recap. Now, both of these matches, oh my goodness, we've got first quarterfinal, Zverev toppling Alcaraz. Now, he ran home into tiebreak in the third. We had Alcaraz with the biggest grin on his face, and then Zverev was able to hold it together. Now, I think before this match, it was either Alcaraz was going to play his game and Zverev was just going to play his baseline level of play, or Zverev was going to up the ante. Zverev was going to play at that level that took him to that US Open final. And the question really was he going to bring it? Was he capable of peaking? And he had progressively been steadily peaking throughout the tournament. And you know what? This is what happened. The first two sets, Zverev played his game like he's capable of, and Alcaraz did not play bad. Zverev played good. He played at that level of a top 10 player who was peaking, and that is why it was not surprising. It was actually really fun to watch for Zverev. But we're looking at these key metrics, remember, and it's not that Alcaraz's metrics weren't there, it's the placement and positioning. Zverev outsmarted Alcaraz in a really good way. What we found in the third, I'm going to say that Zverev got a couple of hiccups because Alcaraz was able to find his way back, and that was tight. That was rough. It was almost looking like it was going to go to 5, and I'm going to say in the fourth, Zverev, his level dropped, but it dropped just enough for Alcaraz to stick with it before Zverev's level was able to finally come out on top. I would say if it went to a 5th, Alcaraz potentially would have brought that home. However, also given the work Alcaraz has had to do in previous rounds, I believe he's had a couple of 5-set matches there. This was actually, those first 2 sets, the cleanest I've seen Zverev play since I think it was the French Open against Nadal when he had that very unfortunate ankle injury there. So this level of play, it is not surprising. We know Zverev is capable of this, and I was really happy for him to deliver, to see that level of play again, because I have not seen it since obviously he was sidelined for that 12-ish months. So this was very well deserved and really exciting to see him back in the semi-finals of a Grand Slam again. All right, Medvedev, Hurkacz, the other quarterfinals that we haven't touched on. I really hope if you're listening, you did watch, or both of these, if not this one. This match has to be, without a doubt, the best match of the tournament because they towed the line. I just cannot stress this enough, the level of play by both of these players. It was stellar. Irrespective if we're talking Zverev to Alcaraz, this one, it was up there. I'm going to say it was the standout quarterfinal because Medvedev was towing the line with Hurkacz the whole way through to the 5th. Despite what the scoreline potentially insinuates, the level of play was that high. It was definitely a fun one to watch. It wasn't a case of one player playing poorly and the other one playing too good. it was very close, and it was very interesting, and I want to underscore that, to watch, because we got to see not only a player's level of maintenance, that baseline, but also them peak periodically throughout the match and at different times, which is very important, I think, to run home. All right, semi-finals. Now, this was a lot of fun. I want to stress that. It was so much fun, because I'm sure not for the players who went down, but look, Medvedev coming back from 2 sets down against Zverev. I think a similar thing happened, similar to that Alcaraz match, whereas Zverev was up those 2 sets, and then that was just a slight glitch, and Medvedev jumped on it. And given that Medvedev, I don't think he gets enough credit. He has won a Grand Slam. He has been to Grand Slam finals before. He knows, he's incredibly smart how to capitalize on fellow top 10 players. And I don't have the metrics in front of me, but given that Zverev has been inside the top 10 for almost as long, if not longer, than Medvedev, I would say. These two have met before, and they would have seen each other's games. Zverev, I think, definitely was capable of closing it out in that tiebreaker, but Medvedev upped his level. Zverev, it's not as such that he regressed, it's just that Zverev peaked early on. He came out of the gates just like he did in the Alcaraz match, but what happened then, Medvedev caught up. In that 3rd set, Medvedev finally was able to find a groove, and in that 4th set tiebreaker as well, Medvedev was just able to hold on, which was heartbreaking for Zverev. And then with that one break in the 5th, Medvedev brought it home. And that was a stellar match. That was equal to, I want to say, Medvedev's previous match with Hurkacz, because one is, oh my goodness, 5 sets back to back is absolutely astounding, and to come out on top. But also then Zverev's performance in the semi-finals, also in the quarterfinals, really needs to be applauded. I'm not going to be surprised this season if Zverev makes another semi-final and potentially a Grand Slam final. Depending who he's up against in that final will depend if he becomes a Grand Slam champion in his own right or not. But he's definitely at this level of play, especially in those first 2 sets against Medvedev and those first 2 sets against Alcaraz. He's definitely primed if he can maintain that throughout the season, that level of play for that final appearance, definitely. And he has that capacity to go all the way. He just needs to focus on those glitches and to keep that focus before he allows his opponent to peak at their own level, because that has shown to become quite problematic for him. All right, I think the next match was a little bit of a surprise packet for a lot of people, though if you have been tracking Sinner and his results, we all know Sinner's success over Djokovic at the end of the season, and I believe it was roughly 3 wins over Djokovic, and I think Djokovic got one in there as well over Sinner. But Sinner's been incredibly successful in that respect over Djokovic. I think the most successful player against Djokovic in the past, not just season, I'll say the last 6 months. He's really been able to find his own and come into his own game. And I want to give a shout out here to a new member of Sinner's team in the last, I think, 2 seasons, which is Darren Cahill. He's an incredibly Australian coach, and you've heard on previous episodes me mention coaches, and some coaches who say they are exceptional in their own right. And what is here is one coach we know, Coach Serena Williams, after Serena Anita _ had already won a number of Grand Slams, came in and worked with Serena to win many more. So we've got that coach. I cannot pronounce his last name very well, but I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. But then we've got the likes of Severin Luthi, who's working with now Rune, who worked with Federer as well as Wawrinka to achieve Grand Slam success. So that's multiple players on top of, say, working with one player to win Grand Slams. We've got Luthi with players with multiple Grand Slams. And now we've got, just as an example, I think it's Will Fischert, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. If not, I apologise. Who's worked with, I believe, Azarenka, Kerber to Osaka. So multiple Grand Slams to his name again, not just one player. Darren Cahill has not only worked with the likes of Agassi, Hewitt, Halep, and Sinner, and I believe there's someone else in there as well that's escaped me, so sorry in advance for that. He has achieved over multiple generations, which is very cool. Not many coaches are still around who worked with that. I think it's Brad Gilbert worked with, I think it was Andy Roddick, and I want to say someone else as well, but also success now with golf with the Grand Slams as an example. So I think it's very important to underscore we've got more than one coach who are able to. There's about 3 or 4 who have achieved Grand Slam success with more than one player, not just one. Even though we've got one who has predominantly appeared on, I think it's Netflix, for example. And that's really important because of all the listeners out there. Remember, even if one coach tells you something, it's not the rule. It doesn't always apply, because just if a coach can achieve really exciting things with one player, it is not universal. There is that level of being able to adapt. There's a reason why one coach has worked with other players, but it's not been able to maintain their position with those players. Others, like Cahill, is a very good example how he has been able to achieve success over an extended period of time. And I really want to underscore this because what he's done with Sinner to overcome Djokovic is absolutely exceptional. And even though I read that Djokovic was not very impressed with how he played, that he was shocked with his performance, for example, I really want to give credit to Sinner, because Sinner made that so. It's not that Djokovic played bad. Sinner did not allow Djokovic to play his game. That's what needs to be highlighted here. Djokovic, he did not play horrendous or awful in any way, shape or form. At the end of the day, it's Novak Djokovic. But Sinner did not allow Djokovic to peak and dictate like he normally does. By all means, in that third set, Djokovic upped his game. He was able to get a bit more rhythm, but Sinner stuck with him, and that's really important and exciting, I think, to share. And that third set, finally, Sinner was able to close that out. There were definitely a bunch of nerves there in those last 2 sets. You could definitely see this was very different, being a Grand Slam final, in contrast to the other matches that have unfolded previously. But it was an absolutely stellar performance from Sinner here, and I think all credit to him. And it's very interesting because it was in the 7 keys to my latest release, the How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking. The changing of the guard has been discussed, and we're starting to see it. Not so much that Sinner's been able to topple Djokovic. We know Alcaraz has been able to. We know Medvedev has in the past as well, but no one more, I think, consistently as Sinner. And the question is if this consistency can be maintained. And I'm going to say if it can be maintained, we're going to see other players begin to step up. I'm going to be very interested to see if Rune can step up and Alcaraz can step up, and they can create that new leading 3. Obviously, the leading 3 that I've touched on previously are the likes of Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer when they were all at the top. And granted, it's been a few seasons since the 3 of them were at the top. Granted, Federer has retired and Nadal has been sidelined. It's really been Djokovic Djokovic with the newcomers. And so these new set of barrier breakers, the next generation. So all credit for Djokovic holding his own. But again, we also know why, because his metrics continue to align. So Sinner is really what our data pinpoints, is that this is the new breed of play, the next generation of play with Alcaraz. However, Sinner is primed to continue to progress. So I'm going to be very interested to see Alcaraz's level of play, especially over the next, I think, 2 to 3 months. Also coming up to the French Open, it'll be very interesting to see how both players perform respectively, and also Rune, if he is that third, or Zverev, I think really ups his ante. I think that's the question there, because Medvedev and Zverev, I think they're just a little bit older, later 20s there, but we've got the earlier 20s, let's say. Just with Alcaraz now and Sinner, it really sets a very interesting / healthy precedent for the men's game, which now brings us to the final. Sinner, Medvedev. Really heartbreaking for Medvedev from 2 sets up to go down against Sinner. But if you're like me, you're sitting there in the 3rd set going, oh my goodness, is this going to go to 5, or is Medvedev going to close this out in 3? And I really have to say, it looked like Sinner, he just could not find the form. It really looked like Djokovic took all the gas out of Sinner's tank. But I tell you what, Medvedev, he played incredibly smart. He played a very different game tactically, strategically, compared to his other or his most recent 2, given that they were both 5-setters. He knew that he did not have the legs. He knew that he did not have, let's say, that firepower in him to last that level over 5. I mean, he gave it one heck of a shot, though. These matches, these sets were incredibly close, but Sinner, he had the gas in the tank. He had the gas to push it that little bit further, and that's what he did in the 3rd, and then he did it again in the 4th and in the 5th. And we really need to remember that this scoreline really shows just one break of serve is all it takes and or took in this respect, which is really exciting how close it was. But I guess at the same time, this is why it is a Grand Slam, that it can be so incredibly close. And on both sides, the women's and the men's, there were some exceptionally close matches. We had, was it the Rybakina from memory, tiebreak? Oh my goodness. So I don't know how many men's matches I saw in 5. This has to be one of the best Australian Opens and the quality of play and tennis I've seen in most recent seasons. So I think many players really need to be applauded, and I hope with this special edition of the Australian Open, I've shared that there's not just 1 or 2, there's a number of players that really need to be pinpointed and reviewed throughout the season, and we're already, even though it's only been 3 days since the championships, or 4 days with the women's matches, we're already seeing some players regress in these tournaments that have started this week, and some who are able to maintain that level of play. So this is going to be very interesting to review whether or not there are changes, and this is what happens between each respective Grand Slam. However, between the Australian Open and the French Open is the biggest gap. So between the French and Wimbledon, the gap is not as big. Same with Wimbledon and the US Open. So this period now is incredibly crucial for these players, establishing their baseline for the season, building that level of maintenance, integrating those 8 keys. If you are a player listening that has played at the Australian Open and you're looking to progress this season, this is your window now. These next 3 to 4 months are absolutely pivotal for you to integrate not just the 7 keys, but the 8 keys, because if you're able to do that in one way, shape or form, not only do we know you will progress. But by the end of the season, if you've integrated more, so maybe you've got 2 now and you end the season with 6, and then the next season you have all 8, because remember, it does not happen overnight. You are setting yourself up to cross the threshold inside the top 10. However, time frames are going to depend on your current ranking and your current rate of progress, because look, at the end of the day, this is what Beyond Top Tennis is all about, helping you, guiding you to allow you to progress towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for listening today. Oh my goodness, I hope you had just as much fun as me, but oh my goodness, has it been a whirlwind. What do we do? Days 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. That's 5 days there, but not as many matches, I think, as it seems, because we had to finish off the second half of the quarterfinals of both sides, the men's and the women's, semi-finals, and then the championships for both the women and the men. And oh my goodness, we had the barrier breakers in there. We've had the crossing a threshold. We've got the newcomers. So many players fresh into the round of 16 on the radar. These are going to be ones to watch. But I really hope each and every one of you, whether you are new or you've been listening to Beyond Top 10 Tennis since we've come out, 1, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. 2, I really hope you've enjoyed these special editions. To grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Coaching Success. So that's the text we're up to prior to this special edition. So just to keep pace with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, where we've been and where we're going, you can grab a copy there at AIMA International. But look, to grab your copy of my new release, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking, which is absolutely pivotal for the 2024 season if you're looking to capitalize on your result of the 2024 Australian Open and to build on that baseline throughout the 2024 season. Find it on AIMA International or grab it on Amazon. So depending where you're based in the world, whatever works best for you, so you can get your hands on that sooner, please do. For any comments or questions, head on over to AIMA International or Topic Thread, the social platform set on data privacy. To interact with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, head on over to Twitter, Threads, or Instagram. To catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok. And to catch up on our blogs, head on over to AIMA International and look for our blog tab, or head on over to Medium. And as always, I'll leave all the links in the episode notes. For something a little bit different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. To view this week's question and poll, be sure to visit Spotify, or for something left of field, visit Sprout for some random polls. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. And for those who are interested, we do have scholarships available on AIMA International, as well as options to work with me exclusively to optimize your performance to nudge you closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking. So don't be shy and come and say hi. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I am so incredibly grateful. I'm your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.